All right, our next speaker is Charlie Luce. Charlie is a research hydrologist for the USDA Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station in Boise, whose research focuses on forest-water relations and aquatic ecosystems in forests. He works in a multidisciplinary context with aquatic ecologists, forest ecologists, and meteorologists to understand coupled changes in ecohydrology of forests and streams. So please join me in welcoming Charlie.
Thank you, Alexander. Good morning. Got a lot of speakers going here at once. This is at the bottom, just mentioned the team that's been working very hard on the GRAPE program and this restoration work, getting a chance to present it today. Our relationship with roads in the West and forest roads is fraught at times. We certainly very much appreciate them. They deliver many of our ecosystem services, whether those be recreational opportunities, access to the recreation that we want to do that may not involve roads, bringing out the timber, bringing out other things, but they also pose a liability in terms of the water quality, wildlife aspects and wildlife interference. One of the principal mechanisms for getting weeds dispersed into the wildlands. And of course, there's the simple cost. And this should be added to Elise's slide of Forest Service great things. We have 400,000 miles of road just on the Forest Service. If we had beyond, it'd be a lot more. And contrast that to the national highway system, interstates and U.S. highways at 156,000 miles. So we're looking at something like 2.5 times as many miles as federal highways manages. Of course, they have a lot more lanes. But in any event, we've got a lot of roads out there. They're expensive to work with. They have these liability aspects and a lot of these great assets. So how do we work with that? At this stage, we understand that we're a bit behind. We're ahead on more roads out there than we can work with, and the quality of those roads, we're behind in terms of the maintenance. And so in terms of restoration and the context of this meeting, which is managing water by managing land, this is a very tiny proportion of the landscape that has an outsized influence on what the waters look like and their character. So building this information strategy around that to help us make us more successful, more effective, and more efficient is important. There are two pieces to it. Setting priorities, which are the best roads, which are the most important roads to be working on, whether that's by armoring them and improving them or just getting rid of them, and then evaluating our practices on those and seeing how well we're successful. So these are the two important pieces of the information side of that, not just getting the work done. For prioritization, we've developed this tool called GRAPE, the Geomorphic Roads Analysis and Inventory Package. GRAPE 2 was programmed by Dave Tarbotten here in the back, and his staff in the back here at Utah State, using very advanced topography-related tools to take a look at DEMs, because roads aren't just lines on a map, they're lines draped over a complex landscape, and it's the interaction with that landscape that's one of the principal ways that we can understand what roads do. So the most damaging roads are the roads that are on steep land near streams, all a function of what the topography does to form streams and how the roads sit on that. The GRAPE Lite takes the information that we've done from years of surveys using the inventory of GRAPE and GRAPE 2 to build some relationships that help simplify and make more rapid and applicable to larger scales some of that information. The GRAPE, just the simple aspect of it here, not the GRAPE Lite, actually the more complex, covers all of these kinds of risk, stream crossing, gullies, landslides, the condition of the infrastructure itself, which for the most part I've gotten a lot of help from budget officers on districts. They said, yes, we want to know that because we want to know where to spend money this year. Sediment delivery, hydrologic connectivity, which is where a lot of people interested in aquatic ecosystems are concerned. The second piece, the GRAPE Lite, really focuses just on those two and just the mechanics of that, because you really need to know exactly where the road drains to be able to get an how it affects gullies, landslides, and that kind of behavior. But there's interest in doing what are the impacts of our road system at very broad scales as well. So the GRAPE field inventory is quite detailed. We allow for a couple of drain paths along each road segment. We look at the conditions of those flow paths, how much vegetation's in them, what the road surfacing type is, and whether or not each drain point delivers and exactly where it sits in terms of the topography on the landscape. So the outputs of that can be very detailed maps of what each road segment is producing in terms of sediment, how much it's delivering, where each drain point is and what it's delivering, as well as how that interacts with the landscape. So on the right-hand side here, what you're looking at is the SynMap map of where the landslide risk has increased as a function of having roads on the landscape, or decreased by shifting the water around. Because this very tiny fraction of land moves a lot of water laterally through the system. Grape Light, in contrast, takes the corporate road data, which includes information about what the road surfacing is, how much traffic is expected. There's a bit of information there. Drapes over the landscape, again in detailed ways, to use that information to build big maps. This is 3 national forests in Montana, chunks of the Kootenai, Helena, and Flathead National Forests. And looking at that, you can see some of these watersheds have a few more red splotches and yellow splotches than others. So we can take and say, okay, let's take our resources at the broad scale and focus on those. So it's 2 different layers here. One's the satellite view, not just the 30,000 foot view, but the 30 million foot view. And one's more, not quite the microscope level, but getting close to that. And what we've wanted to do is build this set of tools so you can scale effort versus the information you get out of it, because we don't always want this much effort. It's more expensive, it's slower, and sometimes we want a little bit more than just the broad scale approximate map, and being able to do a little bit of calibration in between. Right now, the default high level view is just road density, and we can do quite a bit better than that. If we look in terms of this, what's called a Pareto relationship, the bottom here is the percent of the road, left here is the percent of the sediment delivery. So here we're looking at, with a grape analysis, which is a pretty detailed survey, about 30% of the road network, or here with 15% of the road network, you can cover 90% of the sediment yield if you could address that. So that's about as well as you can probably do. If you're dealing just with road density, you're really saying all roads are equal, one road segment's about the same as the next, and so if you build your priority off of road density, you're doing a very inefficient design. With Grape Light, which isn't that much more effort now than doing road density, you can actually move quite a bit further up into this corner, and that's the whole idea of trying to use our understanding of roads and gravity and topography to help advance our modeling there to improve prioritization. The second piece that I want to talk about here is evaluation. That, again, in 2 pieces. One is the legacy roads, where we're using these grape inventories to understand what has gone on over the last decade or so. We've had this legacy roads program from 2008 to 2017, where we've invested $300 million into roads specifically for the purposes of improving water quality and the impacts of those roads to the water system. And then the monitoring project was a tiny tack on to that to evaluate how well this did for these 2 different storm damage risk reduction type treatments on roads that are traveled versus decommissioning of roads. So the questions we're asking from that: are we spending our money wisely? Of course, the one that the people who have advanced the bill to fund this had. What happens if we do nothing, of course, is an important question in there. Are the problems being solved in the long term is an important piece of that. And can we improve practices? This is what most of the practitioners really care about. Is this is their bottom line question, is how can I do a better job? So we looked at addressing all of those. The study design is fairly simple. You have controls and treatment areas. And of course, I say simple. Having a control means that on this same hillside with roads that are fairly similar in class, we asked and pushed very hard, and sometimes they said no, the practitioners, to not treat those roads and leave known risks in place so that we could learn. And this is the idea that sits behind what you've heard called adaptive management, as it was originally envisioned back in the mid-'80s, is you want the information's more valuable sometimes than the treatment. And in this case, we did a few select sites where we asked them, leave these in place and we will see what happens when we don't treat them. Then we went back and evaluated them after the treatments, what changed during that. And then, of course, we wanted to know more. We wanted to know, after we've ruffled up all this soil, what happens when a big storm comes along. And as Willa Cather pointed out in the 1800s, there's some things you learn best in calm and some in storm. So we went back after the fact, look, and sometimes things were a bit rough on the things we had treated. And of course, the ones that we asked them to leave behind said, oh, please. Of course, things went wrong there as well. So that was what they were worried about. But it's being able to contrast these, which are going across the slope versus along the slope, for instance, that is an interesting story in itself. The treatments, decommissioning, things like removing the infrastructure, outsloping, decompacting the road surface by tilling or by ripping. Some people just use excavators and dug holes in it. Here's the kind of practices that we saw across the various regions. In red here, we've marked the ones where they just put a gate up or put boulders up in front and really didn't do that much else and said, this is decommissioned, we're done with this road. As opposed to a fair number of people did a lot of recontouring. That was one of the more popular practices. And then these are all various versions of just decompacting the road surface itself, which is also a very popular practice depending on where you went. But very coherent sets of practices by region there. The storm damage risk reduction treatments were essentially downscaled. The point here was to leave the roads drivable over time. So they added new drainage sometimes to help protect the road system from water running along the road. They did heavier maintenance. They added gravel surfacing, those kinds of things. We monitored over 45 sites. There were actually 51, but those were a different set of treatments and questions across 4 regions in the West. 29 of the sites were decommissioning comparisons and 16 for the storm damage risk reduction. We want to look at expectations here first for the most part, and these are the items that GRAPE analyzes: fine sediment delivery, the connectivity of the road system, landslide risk and gully risk. All of these we expect to see go down quite a bit as we do the decommissioning. Stream crossing failure risks, especially where we're removing the stream crossings altogether, we expect that to go down quite a lot. Although, as pointed out, sometimes they didn't remove all of those. The drain point condition we expect to improve, again, if they're being removed. And the road segment condition, sometimes, as you saw on that last slide, it can actually get worse at times or a bit better, but we expect on the net because the vegetation has the opportunity to grow for improvements. For storm damage risk reduction, fairly similar behaviors, mostly downscaled. Stream crossings are not getting removed, but a lot of questions because these are different costs. This is a lot cheaper. You can do more of it on the landscape. Can you buy more for your water by doing a lot of damage, storm damage risk reduction versus decommissioning? Or should you focus all the effort on decommissioning, for instance? In terms of the outcomes for this, now I'll go through a set of slides that look a lot like this. This is the fine sediment delivery. On the left here is the treatment for the decommissioning, and then these are the control roads. A lot of variability after the storms. Some got worse, some better, but for the most part, not a lot of change in terms of how much sediment they are delivering, but quite a bit of reduction here for the roads that we decommissioned. For storm damage risk reduction, again, a fairly sizable reduction after the storms in terms of the sediment delivery from those, but also on the control plots there, a bit of reduction over time, vegetation regrowing, that kind of thing. For hydrologic connectivity, again, a very strong reduction for the treated decommissioned roads. But when we look over the storm damage risk reduction roads, actually not much change in delivery. So we don't, by adding more drainage and things like that, we didn't actually accomplish as much deconnection hydraulically of that road system from the stream system as we might have expected. An interesting set of outcomes came from looking at how did landslides occur after the storm or other mass wasting, including gullies. So this sort of looks like you might expect, although we add in values here to point out these are very small samples. After the decommissioning treatment, we got more landslides, but smaller, and then we got a few larger landslides and fewer of them if we didn't treat. That may be a wash. It may be a useful signal, certainly worth something looking at. Not much change and very little additional new landslide development on the SDRR roads. In part, what this says is we should be decommissioning the roads that we decommissioned. It says that those were roads that were selected because they were problematic, and sure enough, whether they were there or not, they were on troublesome landscapes. This was a more interesting outcome. We noticed quite a few, just in general, new gullies. But this is on the treated roads, and this is where we added new drainage below the roads on landscapes that were too steep. There was actually no good place to put the water from those roads because it was moved sideways across the landscape and then dumped off into a new place. We generated a couple of new very large gullies. Again, just 2 gullies represented in those 2 bars, so it may not be all that informative in a statistical sense, but it does inform us that there's a risk. If you dump water onto steep landscapes, you're probably going to generate a gully. So a point of caution there. The road surface condition improved in both the storm damage risk reduction. Of course, they grade those, add gravel, that kind of thing, what you might expect there, and pretty large improvements in the road surface condition when we've done the decommissioning. And a very similar picture there when we look at the flow path, although when we're looking at the storm damage risk reduction, a lot more variability in terms of the outcomes from that. Again, the point there is they went in, they did the grading and resurfacing on that, but sometimes the ditches and things like that after the storms were in worse condition. The road drainage features, individual culverts, rusty versus plugged, those kinds of behaviors. Decommissioning, because we're getting rid of a lot of these, there aren't a lot of them to have problems, so that was reduced, and in the control, not that much. For the treated and the storm damage risk reduction, we left the culverts in for the most part, even added a few, not a lot of change there. A more interesting set of pictures arrives when we start looking at the stream crossing and stream crossing treatments for the decommissioning. So we get plugging associated with these stream crossings. Big piles of wood come in, for instance, above the road. Sometimes they overtop and rip out here and run down the hill. And everything can look fine downstream of the culvert, but on the upstream side we can see the risk to the system. There are 2 outcomes that might be generated from that. One is it picks up and moves down the road, it turns, it fills up behind the culvert and actually starts flowing along the road. And then dumps off down the hillside somewhere where there's never been a stream before, usually in a steeper place, and builds a new stream course. And sometimes it just locally blows out that particular piece of sediment, which is a lot of sediment, but generally a much smaller problem than when that happens. So here's an example of where it turned down the road and then dumped off the side of the road there. And this is where the treatments are done to try and block it from, in this case, we're looking down the road. And you can see that if it plugged now, rather than turning and running down the road and off to the hillside, it just would affect this location primarily. So we looked at systems where things might go like this in terms of the topography versus like that. And for the most part, after decommissioning, we had substantial improvements, whereas if we did nothing, not much changed. Again, for storm damage risk reduction, we did a few of those, retaining the travel on the road, and saw improvements there in terms of the risk that might happen of that kind of behavior. Beyond that, when we excavated the road system, the culvert system along these roads doing decommissioning, we did surveys to look at the outcomes of that, both in terms of what they removed and what then the stream took care of after the fact. In terms of the volume excavated, the first thing I'll point out is we've got one up here at 25,000 cubic meters of road, and it looked like this up on the Olympic, steep and deep crossing there. They removed quite a bit of material out of that. Here's the general sense for across many national forests, divided in color by the different regions, but you can see there are a couple of forests here, the Umpqua and the Olympic, that had particularly large removals coming out of them, but quite a bit of material. And the important point here is this is an axis that runs into the thousands with numbers around 5,000 here and a mean volume of 1,400 and 600 for a median. When we look at how much erosion then happened after that, because we're leaving stuff behind there in this road, in this stream spot, a few places like the Olympic had quite a bit, but the numbers are really quite a bit smaller, median and means in the teens and tens. This is what it looks like in terms of a stream crossing excavation. The excavator comes down, grabs a hold of the pipe, lifts it out. You have the stream still running over a fairly smooth surface. And then they do this nice little stream restoration, the bowling alley style that would do our speaker from yesterday. Very proud here. When we Look at the outcome of that, though. Nature does, after a 7 to 25-year storm, bowl with big boulders down this, and we saw quite a bit. This is a person for scale. A lot of changes in some of these. And when we look at the covariance for that, the big one there was the depth of channel incision was quite dramatic and a major control on what happened there. Oh, it was Joe Wheaton yesterday talking about the bowling alleys. And so these are the new gutters in the bowling alleys after the fact that nature's cut for us. And for the most part, we just didn't dig deep enough. And that was the big upshot there. Outcomes, treatments improve conditions, mostly what we expect. The storm damage risk reductions can add gullies if we put them in the wrong places. A few excavated stream crossings had large eroded volumes where we didn't dig deep enough. And aside from mistakes, if we do nothing, the consequences look like they'd be worse. So it's worth putting effort into, and it's worth putting smart effort into. For stream crossing excavations, remove all the fill and look for older buried pipes. For the most part, an earlier failure typically left the sense that the stream bottom was there and they thought they had gotten to it and they missed. So look again for the pipes that are there. For storm damage risk reduction, don't dump water onto steep hillsides off of roads. We already know that, but if you're adding drainage, don't add it there, keep it going to the stream. And then one more point of evaluation using grape light. Here's the Northwest Forest Plan. And on the left here, we see as a result of some of these dollars that I point out were invested, about a third of them, $100 million in this area, over 10 years. We saw a decrease in the connected road length. We saw a bigger change in delivered sediment. It says we picked some good roads and did some good treatments in terms of improving the delivery of sediment and a bit so in terms of delivery of water. But what was interesting was we got rid of our best roads. So when we look at the delivery ratio in terms of total road length, we see that it actually increased. So we got rid of a lot of ridgetop roads or roads that are mid-slope and weren't connected anyway, and that money wasn't well spent in terms of trying to improve water resources. So it's nice to have this capability with a tool like Grape Light to look retrospectively because we have this corporate database in a place like the Forest Service and BLM. And beyond that, many thanks to the people who did all these inventories over the years. We had about 60 of them in the various crews out there tromping up and down roads in various states of repair and doing these surveys. Quite a good group of people, and hopefully a few of them have been hired by the Forest Service since to work on road systems. And if you want more information on these tools, that's the website to look at. Many thanks. That was over the whole initiative, about that. It was about 10 years and it's ended.
Right. Well, I guess I was just curious with the stark difference between the one director, Boise, if I pronounce that right, between the 4 million, which I'm sure you were very excited to get, but I suspect you asked for a lot more. That is just such a stark number. And, it just seems to me that we approach, fire remediation the same way we do healthcare. We treat the illness instead of wellness or preventative. And so I'm curious how your initiative and your initiative are in relationship and if you work together in collaboration.
No, this was a congressional act and mostly is reprogramming dollars from Forest Service maintenance that would take care of things like brushing and safety and like guardrails and things like that. And said, no, you will be improving our water conditions, which incidentally improved safety in those places. Our backlog was great enough on all of our maintenance that it actually accomplished both in many ways. But eventually the people concerned about safety have pushed back and said, we need to refocus efforts on that again. So it's mostly been reprogramming within the agency by Congress. Exactly, yeah. Not falling off the road. Forest road safety is pretty complicated because you'd think, oh, well, we can add pavement, but pavement decreases safety quite a bit.
Can I just add to that? you know, while the efforts that we've each talked about are not connected, they could clearly have an impact. What we've just heard here will certainly play an impact on the work that we want to do on the ground. Your point that the funding source that we're talking about for some of the efforts that we need to do is minuscule. Yes, it is, and the need is great. And I just wanted to say that. We recognize that, but we work with what we've got.
All right. Oh, got one here.
Talk about training resources for the great tools.
Training resources?
Training, yeah.
So online and by email, Tom Black usually reaches out. He's one of the people in the picture there and one of the principals there in the GRAPE program. Reaches out for GRAPE training, and then we're doing more and more of the GRAPE Light training. EPA has been really helpful in providing funding to help us get more training out on that. And right now we're in the process of building a video because people come to the trainings and then say, oh, this is great, I'll get to apply it sometime. And several months later, they'll open it up and go, what was the first button? So we want to get that out there on YouTube to help people with that. So the combination of these things is there. And if you go to this website, you can find mine or Tom's address and ask to be connected for when we do training. But there is a GRAPE training annually, then GRAPE Light is sporadically as we get an opportunity. And the regions usually involved, Region 4 frequently is involved. What state are you in?
Region 3 in Mexico.
Okay, we haven't gotten down there. And if you'd like us to come down there, then send an email and we will make an effort to come down.
Sure.
You bet. Great.
Speak a bit about the connection with aquatics and salmon recovery in the Pacific Northwest of prioritization, especially with respect to other types of interventions like dam removal with fish ladders or fisheries. Totally different domain, but I see a lot of money spent on this, making a bigger thing for its buck, perhaps.
Right. Right, so the question's about salmon recovery, specifically in the Pacific Northwest. And to give some context to that, the person who is in the office next to me occasionally now, he's moved out of town, but he still comes in there, is Russ Thoreau. And what he's pointed out time and time again is we've got some of the most amazing habitat available for salmon in central Idaho. And it's underused because not enough salmon come back from the ocean to reseed it. And yes, BPA provides funds for this kind of activity, but it's probably not the most important set of tasks we can do. It does improve habitat quality and continues to, so that at such time as it is reseeded, there's more of it available, and that's for salmon. Then the other species and the rest of that ecosystem's health, this is an important value there too, and I don't think Russ is thinking in terms of those cascades, but pointing out that the dams are the key problem. Yeah.
Great stuff, Charlie. Thank you. And probably the most important part of protecting water quality is the forest. Just wanted to see if you had a comment. All the areas, the beautiful areas that you talked about, all have timber revenues to deal with their roads. Here in the region, we don't have so much of that. It's a big challenge coming up with the revenue. There's a lot of culverts that need to be tore out and that sort of thing. Any comment about how we can address that?
This is circling back to our first question. So when I started with the Forest Service, it was actually not in the research branch, but in the rest of it. And I worked in a district that had 20 million board feet. Or no, it was individual sales were 20 million. 90 million board feet a year as its target for just the district in Region 6. So they used what they called wooden nickels, and they were very big wooden nickels, to do a lot of the road work and improvement and keep them in good shape. And then when that went away, the spotted owl things, they were in a tough spot, and that's where a lot of the road maintenance backlog has come from. And to address that, Maria Cantwell was the leader in getting this thing happen from Washington for the Legacy Roads program. And again, it's gone back. If water quality continues to be the problem, that's the only, funding comes from Congress, and they're the only people to talk to about it. And then it's, I think the lesson there is be careful what you wish for. If they say, oh yeah, that's a good idea, let's steal it from this side. And yeah, post-fire, there's some opportunities. again, for salmon recovery related and removal of culverts, that kind of thing. But it's, yeah, money is very complex these days.
All right, thank you very much, Charlie.